Hey everybody, welcome to the More and Better Disciples channel here on YouTube, and I am excited to be with you tonight because I think we have a very interesting topic, number one, but number two, I'm filming this in one of my favorite places that I can be, and that is in my basement with my hobby room around me, and that is a HO scale model train layout. You can see some of the cars in the background. Maybe at the end of the video, I'll give you a little sneak peek if you hang on till then. Give you a little peek of my train room here and airplane memorabilia and my little flight simulator desk that I use as well to stay proficient. Because those of you who know me know that I'm a private pilot as well as a pastor, and I enjoy flying, and I enjoy flying airplanes. I fly Cessna 172. I've flown a Cherokee 140. Flown Piper Tomahawk in my career of flying and piloting Cessna 152s. I've even flown, and right now I've been flying a 172 out of Alexandria. AXN is the airport code on that, so for all you airplane geeks that might follow along. Anyway, I wanted to talk to you today about a topic that's kind of rearing its ugly head, and every once in a while in the Bible world we start to see and start to hear talk about what the will of God is, okay? You'll hear terms thrown out like God's permissive will and God's sovereign will. Or sometimes you'll hear the will of God, and it'll just be thrown around like, I just can't discern what God's will is for my life. Or you'll hear it thrown around like, I just don't understand what God's will is for this event or this time or this place. Or, the one that's being asked a lot right now, to be honest with you, is I just don't know what God's will is through this entire pandemic thing going on. I just don't understand what God is really trying to do. And I hope by the end of this video that number one, your heart won't be troubled, but number two, that you'll understand a little bit more about what the Bible actually says when it comes to this idea of God's permissive will and God's sovereign will. Or can we say it this way? What God's plan is and what God's will is. And we're going to start off with Greek, and I don't want to bore you with Greek, but there's two Greek words that really matter when it comes to the translation of the Bible. One is boulomai, and boulomai is an interesting word and can be translated as just will. It can be translated as just will, W-I-L-L. And then thelema is the other Greek word, which is also translated will. And here in just a minute, we're going to get into those two words and why they matter. And the videos that we've been watching up to this, or the videos that you've watched up to this point, have talked about verses that all, for the most part, have the will of God in them. Romans 8:28 and 29 talk about God's will. We also know that Romans 12:1 and 2 talks about God's will. And the question is it thelema will or is it boulomai will that's being used in those verses? And to understand those verses and understand this, the difference between these two Greek words in the Bible is going to help you immensely in understanding what the Bible actually is telling you. Now, what I'm not telling you, though, is this. You don't need to know Greek and you don't need to know Hebrew to find out what the Bible says. But when you do know those things, it does help. And you don't even have to know Greek and Hebrew. There are excellent helps today, online helps. If you're old school and you like big, fat books, Strong's Concordance is an amazing one. It's also on the internet. You can find an interlinear Bible with Strong's numbers, and you can look up the Strong's Concordance numbers and find out what words actually mean that are translated in your Bible in English. So if you've ever wondered where in the world do pastors figure all that out, well, Strong's Concordance is a great place to start. But as we get into our video here, I do want to talk about the fact that man has been given a free will. Man has free will. We can choose to do, but we are not a moral agent that can act upon and do whatever we want. There are limitations to our will. God sovereignly is able to choose and even allows man to sometimes act in opposition to his will. And God allows that to happen in our world today. And that opposition comes against his perfect will, okay? Or we'll use the word thelema here. This is the Greek word thelema. His perfect will. But not his ultimate plan, which is belema. God's plan is going to be accomplished. There's going to be a day when an Antichrist rises up. There's going to be a day when Jesus Christ sets up his earthly kingdom. There's going to be a day when Jesus Christ raptures the church back to be with him, or raptures the church up to be with him in heaven, and Jesus Christ comes back again. There's going to be a day in God's plan in which Satan and hell are cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. These things are going to happen. That is all part of God's overall sovereign plan for the world and for the universe, for his creation, we could say. But within that plan, God does have some things that he wills, and he has desires for mankind that they would do. And for our study this afternoon, or our study in this video, our English translations do a terrible job at trying to differentiate these two words in English. Matter of fact, they're both just translated will. To translate them both as will is not accurate enough, though, for most applications when it comes to Bible study. Thelema expresses an active choice, whether God's or man's, and in most cases is properly translated as will. However, belema, though, is more of a predisposition, if you will, from which an active choice comes, okay? In other words, a plan and a perspective, mainly God's perspective, a plan that is even inclusive of man's disobedience to God's will. So let me see if we can clarify it a little more. Man, because of the authority that is granted to us over the earth, we are allowed for a period of time to violate the will of God. This is God's thelema will. But man cannot violate God's predetermined plan for the world. His predestined plan. We see a little peek of this in Ephesians chapter 1, where God talks about predestination, election, and these kind of doctrines. And one day in a video, we'll get into those things. But God has predetermined his plan, his counsel, and predestined his good purpose in all things that they should conform to. This is belema, will. If man's active choice cannot be worked to good, conform to God's good will and purpose, then it is not allowed, period. Chew on that for a little bit. You know, sometimes you'll hear people talking about God's perfect will. And God's perfect will, God's permissive will, these are things. God's perfect will would be God's plan. And God's permissive will would be when man makes decisions that go against what God's will is or God's desire is for mankind. And sometimes people get that messed up. God's perfect will is his thelema, and he allows us to act in opposition to his own will sometimes in that. But his belema will always, mark this down, his belema will always be accomplished. That is predetermined. So God will allow mankind to violate his will for a period of time, but that cannot be in opposition to his eternal plan that God has for mankind, that was predetermined before the world began. A great study on this, just read 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, because it's not man's wishful thinking on God, but it rather points to the fact that the Father is leaving open the possibility of current opposition to his will concerning the salvation of all for just a matter of time. Even God's thelema will is going to be fulfilled in the end. Thus, God's perfect will and his sovereign will always accomplish God's plan. It's all part of his plan. God did not set out for man to fall, but he knew man was going to fall in the garden. So in God's permissive will, he allows, or in his thelema will, he allows man to make a decision that has a consequence that gets him kicked out of the Garden of Eden. He knows that the motivation for this decision is going to be to want to be like God. And God has to judge that. It goes against his holiness, it goes against his set apartness, and it goes against his person. God can't stand sin. So man has to be kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And when he's kicked out of the Garden of Eden, God in heaven doesn't say, oh no, my plan, it's out of control. No, before the foundation of the world, God had predestined that Jesus Christ would die for the sin of mankind and that we would have salvation. So we can kind of see that in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4. So let me give you an equation, okay? Even God's thelema will be fulfilled in the end. But for now, that thelema will can be resisted by man's actions and man's decisions. So this is only temporary, because will plus time equals the plan. Let me give you that equation again. God's will plus time equals God's plan. So the overall plan of God factors in time. The difference between God's thelema will and his belema will is time. Maybe the only way we'll understand this really and recognize the only way that this can ultimately come to fruition is to determine goodness or the badness of something is the person who has all the facts at his disposal, right? If something is good or bad, we can flip-flop in that depending on the sources we find out, the situation, the dynamics that we find out. We hear about an airplane crash and we're like, oh, that's terrible. I hope the crew is okay. But then you find out there was no crew in it and they crashed it on purpose to see what would happen. And then you say, oh, well, that's great because we can learn so much. Well, it's the same airplane crash. The difference is having all the facts in time. And what God holds in his hands is the past, the present, and the future. He knows what happened in the past. He knows what's going on in the present. He knows what's going to happen in the future. And thus God's plan supersedes time. But God's will works in our timeline. And it works interactively with man. When we reject God's will, we rebel against him. We're able to get away with it for a time. But in the end, we will conform to the image of God. So let me give you just a few things, a few facts real quick to kind of help you. And then I'll start with the letter R. And I hope these will help you out. I'm going to give them to you and then we'll recap and I'll break down each one real quick. Number one is recognize. Recognize. Then remember, reflect, refuse, and resist. So let me kind of cover this for you. So when we're talking about God's will, let me give you a couple things. Number one, recognize that there's nothing fundamentally surprising about being exposed to bad things. When bad things happen, that can be God's will and can be part of God's plan. COVID-19 can be part of God's will and part of God's plan. It absolutely can. How do we know that? Well, Jesus himself went through bad things. Jesus himself struggled through hard times. So hard times is not something that man receives just because he's man. So we need to recognize that just because something bad happens does not mean it doesn't work according to God's ultimate plan. Because remember, God's will and time equal God's plan. So number one, recognize. Number two, remember. Remember what God permits in your life will never outstrip the grace that he makes available to you to enable you to live well by it. So remember that. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatever you do to the glory of God. Number three, reflect on the way that difficulties and stresses are often the means to development and growth. This comes back to James 1. Count it all joy when you fall into many different trials. This is one of our first videos. If you missed that one, go back and check it out. So we rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, character, hope. Romans chapter 5, verse 4. Check it out. Number 4, refuse. Refuse to be intimidated by forces that oppose you in life, and recognize that the way you conduct yourself in hard times is evidence of what's already here and already here. So refuse to be intimidated by forces outside that are going to go contrary to what's here and what's here. All right. And number 5, resist. Resist the temptation to resent the hard edges of God's will by acknowledging the fact that people suffer according to God's will. People suffer according to God's will. This goes contrary to the health, wealth, prosperity gospel. But check it out for yourself. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9. Mark it down. It's in your Bible that we are blessed by God's gracious provision when we're in a trial. In fact, in some way, that's almost too difficult for us to grasp mentally, that God would allow us to suffer according to his will. But if you really stop and think about it, didn't Jesus suffer according to God's will? The Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed, not my will, but your will be done. And then he went to the cross, and on the cross he did what? He suffered and died in the will of God and in the plan of God. So, as Jesus prayed in the garden, not my will, but God's will, I pray that your will is not being accomplished in this life, but God's will is. And my prayer for you as you watch this video is that you understand the difference between thelema and bulimai. Thelema is my will and God's will, God's desire for us to do something, and our rejection or our acceptance of that, making our will his will, thelema. But in the end, God's plan will be accomplished. The bulimai plan of God will be accomplished, and that too is translated will. So I hope that helps you out a little bit when you hear God's permissive, God's sovereign will, which one is going on, and how does that work with man's free will? Well, let me kind of give you a 3-tier system, okay? Here's man's will, here's God's will, and here is God's plan. God's plan supersedes God's will. God's will supersedes man's will. Man has control for a time period, but then God's will comes in and helps out get man and conformed to God's will again. And then as we conform to God's will, we're back in God's plan, and given enough time, given enough space, given enough matter, God's will plus time equals his plan. So hope that helps you out. Hope you can think through that. And I promised you a quick sneak peek. We're getting long in the video, so let me give you that sneak peek here. Excuse my finger for just a second here. And welcome to my HO model train layout. Here is the roundhouse with engines inside. Maybe next time we can light this thing up. Got a wind turbine. Got a quick little sneak peek. There's some trains. A lot more back there. Got an airport, because any good airplane guy's got to have an airport. And just a little bit more of the train layout here. So sorry for the jerky camera movements, but I do want to kind of show you. There's some of my airplane paraphernalia over there. And then in the corner there is a flight simulator with yoke, rudder, pedals, the whole 9 yards, so that I can stay proficient in flying without having to fly all the time. So anyway, I'm going to sign off for this video. Thank you for watching the More and Better Disciples channel, and we will see you in the next one. Know that difference. God's will, God's plan, your will. Figure it out. Let me know in the comments below if this helped you out at all. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.